What's the hardest boss fight you have encountered in a gacha game? At times when the difficulty curve shoots straight up, and even though you were coasting along the game fine before, some crazy looking boss enemy stops you in place and poses a significant barrier to your progression. It's true that most modern gacha games don't have big difficulty curves given that mobile gaming has become more casual these days, but it doesn't stop some brave developers from designing a big challenge that makes the player think about how to approach it to finally achieve victory. I have played a sizable amount of gacha games at this point, and I want to document some of my most memorable boss fights, where I hit a brick wall in the story campaign, scratching my head for hours or days before finally feeling the rush of conquering a tough opponent. These are the moments in gacha games where the game goes, alright, you've had enough fun, now it's time to lose. This video is brought to you by Arknights. Arknights is a fantasy-themed strategic RPG that I casually play myself. Currently, the game is celebrating its 6.5-year anniversary, with a new grand side story, First of a Thousand Autumns, which is the conclusion of one of the game's major story arcs. Wang will be the limited operator of this patch, who is a trap master specialist that lets you place these Wei Qi stones on any empty tiles on the map. Accompanied by high damage output, his ability makes him incredibly flexible as his stones have infinite range, and will be joining the ranks of one of the most powerful units in the game upon release. Alongside him on the same banner, Chen is one of the original characters from Arknights, and she is the first operator to get a second alternate form. She is an arts fighter guard that switches damage depending on enemy resistances, so she can always exploit their weakness. You'll also be able to claim the free 5-star operator Ju by participating in the event. As per usual with Arknights anniversaries, you'll be able to claim a premium of rewards, a free daily pull on the limited banner, and the lucky draw that lets you claim Orundum every day. Use the link in the description or pinned comment to download the game today. Thank you again to Arknights for sponsoring this video. For the sake of simplicity, I will be narrowing down the scope of this video. I'm only interested in content in the main story campaign of a gacha game. Optional late game modes, PvP rankings, hard modes for events are out, since that would include way too much content to be considered. What I'm mainly looking for is how the difficulty of the encounter synergizes with how memorable it makes the story. I'm sure everyone can relate to finally beating that one boss from a video game and felt a rush when they finally won. This is, at least how I see it, why you should make a difficult boss stage in a gacha game. Of course, I have not played every gacha game under the sun, so it's likely there will be some examples I miss. So feel free to leave your horror stories for the smaller niche games below. Also, I will not be including content from games that are no longer playable as of making this video. As much as I would love to include the original experience of Tribe 9, that game is dead, and you can't play it now even if you wanted to. There's also a couple things to keep in mind before I go through the examples. First, you will see a lot of cases from older era gacha games, as that was the time when the genre was still relatively underground, so only hardcore anime media fans would play them. These games never had to cater to a mainstream crowd, so sometimes the difficulty, alongside old-school gacha game design philosophy, can cause certain challenging fights to feel absurd due to how much is demanded from the player. Although, it's also worth keeping in mind that it's not exactly beneficial for developers to block the player from progressing in the main story. Since gacha games live and die by their characters and story, you generally want all players to be caught up as much as they can, so it's easier to move the plot along and keep everyone up to date in terms of what's happening in the story. If there's data to suggest that a large portion of players are having trouble with the difficulty in a story fight, then developers will most likely step in and make certain adjustments to make the fight easier. In my opinion, as long as it doesn't completely trivialize them, this is the correct choice for the long-term health of the game. Last thing to keep in mind is that difficulty is extremely subjective, and how a piece of content can be defined as difficult will change over time. It can depend on what characters you pulled from the gacha and the time in which you decide to engage with a piece of content. One of the unfortunate byproducts of gacha game design is that newer characters will generally power creep the older ones over time. And since the developers don't exactly have an incentive to rebalance old story content to match the new bar, a lot of the times a boss fight that used to be considered hard in the past would now be significantly easier. This is basically unavoidable, but just something to keep in mind. I want to start off the list with some games that generally have a big difficulty curve, but nothing that memorable in particular. It doesn't mean that these games are bad or inferior to the other games I'll be talking about. But if you want a break from auto-battling and want to try out a gacha game that demands more of you as a player, here are a few. Mecharashi is a turn-based, mecha-themed RPG that actually gets pretty difficult once you get to the mid-game. I reviewed it in the summer last year, and due to how the gameplay works, there's a lot of variability in enemy behavior and the strategies you can follow. Every unit has breakable armored limbs, and incapacitating them can be just as simple as knocking out their legs if they're a melee unit, then they can't do anything. Breaking one arm makes two-handed weapons less accurate. There's a counter mechanic that can cripple you or the opponent if one is not attacking with an advantage. The first girl's Frontline is also worth a mention. Due to its old-school mechanics, it's not necessarily about strictly how difficult the levels are, but rather about the amount of resources you'll be flushing down the drain if you don't succeed. In its history, event stories would serve as continuations to the main story, and in its early years, events never made a distinction on its normal or hard mode. While the later ones do have an optional hard mode, the early ones didn't, so the high difficulty was just baked into its design. Among those, Chapter 10.5 was one of the more memorable events that had some insanely unfair levels. This level requires you to make a supply line from your command node to the supply node and hold it for 3 turns. The problem is, there's a turn limit, so you're forced to play aggressively to capture nodes and create the line. This normally wouldn't have been that big of an issue, except there's a number of enemy command posts that will endlessly pour troops that you have to fight off. There's these invincible tanks roaming the map on the right, and due to the rules of night battles, you can only see one node adjacent. This means you have a tight schedule to get the stage done, there's endless enemies pouring out every turn, and there are invincible tanks that roam the map that need to be avoided. At the time, this was considered a wall in terms of progression, and even years later when I started playing, I needed some serious help getting it done. There's 2 routes to win. You take the shorter, direct road to the supply node, but fend off endless hordes of enemies, or you can sneak around the back on the bottom left. You can also deploy dummy echelons to intentionally lead the tanks away from your supply line and immediately quit out to save resources. In this game, dolls need to replenish ammo and rations occasionally, and if one is defeated, you must spend more resources to fix them, or they'll just sit in the repair dock indefinitely. If you fail the stage, you don't get your resources back. The last stage in the same event was also pretty tough, where you must make a last stand and must prevent any enemies from capturing your command post in the middle. Your only objective is to survive for a number of turns. Not only is it extremely relevant to what's happening in the story, this endurance battle is also one that forces you to use every resource at your disposal. The same invincible tanks are back, and the battlefield this time is much bigger. Due to how unpredictable enemy behavior is, there's no set way you can clear this except for your own knowledge of the game. By making guesses on where enemies are located if a node turns red or blue, it's one of the more memorable moments I've experienced playing any gacha game. This isn't even talking about some of the event challenge stages, but for the sake of the video, those have been excluded. GFL 1 remains one of the more challenging gacha games I've played, but its story is also one of the best. This one's more on the tamer side, but I'd include Limbus Company here just to appeal to the sleeper agents. I would say there aren't many difficulty barriers that come to mind in recent times, but the most memorable one when I was starting out has got to be Ricardo from Canto 5. This is the first time when the party comes across an antagonist that has such a big power gap that you immediately know you're out of your league. When this chapter was released, not only did you have to brace for his lightning-fast attacks, even when you win, the game will throw a scripted defeat screen. The sudden difficulty spike plays to the game's narratives, and I think it's one of the more memorable moments when gameplay and story come into one. Although, since power creep is quite severe in this game, if a player went in today, got the latest units, then they can easily steamroll Ricardo here. In any case, I'm sure there are a few other cases in Limbus, but I never had that much trouble with anything else except Ricardo. But that's good enough to earn a spot in this video. Of course, we can't have a video discussing difficult content in gacha games without mentioning Arknights. This is the same game where when it launched, it received a wave of negative ratings because one of its tutorial stages was too hard and people actually got stuck in the story. you'll know exactly which one I'm talking about, because that stage will likely stump any newcomer a few times. I've been making my way through the campaign, and I have to say, the unique aspect about Arknights is that a lot of its challenging story stages aren't actually just hard for the sake of being hard, but has mechanical designs that makes it hard in an interesting way, where there are methods to take advantage of the level's gimmicks or endlessly stall the boss to ready your deployed units again. Now, as this game has been running for some time, I find that it's only really the early years of its development where it had the most challenging story content. Since there's a lot of ways to pull for broken units these days, there's less pressure to create higher difficulty spikes, as it may invalidate the older units. Of course, it's absolutely still possible to beat these levels with even low rarity units, and once you see someone do that, you'll notice that each boss fight has a clear gimmick that you can take advantage of, and mastering that gimmick will generally take some practice. I'll be listing 2 example fights in the game that I found both challenging and memorable. The first one is Patriot. This character can probably pass off as a random NPC given how ordinary he looks in the world of Arknights. He barely has any story relevance until you get to the chapter he's featured in, but wow, what a sudden realization when you find out that he has a much more powerful Phase 2 where he can just one-shot some of your weaker units. While a few of the bosses before this chapter can also pose high threats, you get a large amount of time to prepare, and their power level is to be expected due to how much the game builds them up in the story. Patriot, though, is just kinda sitting there near the back of Chapter 7 until you've had the displeasure of fighting him. In the grand scheme of things, I wouldn't say he's that hard, just that due to his massive difficulty curve leading up to the encounter, it's likely to stump new players for a few rounds. These days, though, characters have undergone such power creep to the point where there are a few units in the game that can just solo him. A sad reality for gacha games, but what can you do? The second example comes right after Patriot in Chapter 8, which happens to be that one Tallulah fight. Now, when I was going through the story, I actually completed Chapters 9 and 10 before going back to 7 and 8. While the later chapters also had a few tough opponents, it never felt as difficult as to what I had to endure going up against Tallulah. I'm not that good at tower defense games, and this was the one fight where I actually had to look up a guide. It's one of those cases where the boss fight has specific mechanics that you have to be aware of, or you'll be caught off guard if you try to brute force it with just strong units. This fight mainly has 2 components that you have to constantly monitor. Tallulah will occasionally mark your units with a status that causes them to take a large amount of damage after a while. While the game does say in the menu that she does this, it doesn't say that it's only done on your most recently deployed unit. If you take a look at low rarity clears, you'll see players abusing low cost and low refresh time units to bait out this attack. But the timing is quite tight that you can't look away for a few seconds without messing something up. The second component is this giant wall of fireballs that Tallulah will summon when switching phases. She will do this 2 times during the level, and everything that either doesn't have enough health regen or just extremely tanky will be wiped out. Since the boss and normal enemies literally keep spawning right afterwards, you could be put at a tough spot. Due to how even the most meta units can't tank this, it's demanded that you have to get some well-placed healers to help your surrounding units survive it. I played through some of the game's later chapters and events, but I never had to deal with something like this before. Undoubtedly one of the tougher main story challenges in the game, and one that will likely live in infamy throughout the game's lifespan. You know, some games have this revive mechanic where you can pay a little extra to revive your party if you don't want to bother with a level and just want to get past it? Well, this next game had me using said revive tokens, but even with those, I was having trouble. If you want to hear about one of the toughest challenges I've had to endure in a gacha game's main story, it's gotta be that final boss gauntlet in the last chapter of Morimens. Now, Morimens by itself is pretty hard, and it's one of those gacha games where even the farming stages could stump you if you don't have a properly prepared team. The difficulty really ramps up past chapter 6 or so, and it's really that last stretch where things get really bad. In the very last chapter, there's a gauntlet of bosses that you have to beat in order to unlock the final fight and finish the first arc in the story. Without going through spoilers, the bosses look like these giant eyeballs that have specific gimmicks to test if your team can handle it. Before talking about one of those fights, when Arc 1 of the story concluded, it was a special period during Morimens' development, since at the time it was dangerously close to being shut down, so the idea might have been that there was no point in holding back how difficult it was. Even then, when I got to that point, I learned that these fights have already been nerfed. At the time, I was already running some meta units in the game, and I still had to use the revive tokens occasionally. This section is a brutal onslaught of bosses that will test your limits, and rightfully earns Morimens as one of the hardest gacha games you can play. If we're having a discussion about difficulty spikes, then in my memory, there isn't a better candidate for having some of the hardest and most memorable fights than Fate Grand Order. I spent around 2 years playing this, and due to its old school mindset in its design, the reason that it has so many difficult fights is its ability to push the boundaries of what its 10-year-old game engine allows. It's evident that the game prides itself in having some of the best lore in the Fate franchise. But 10 years later, the game has to work with an engine that was made in 2015 while still needing to innovate on the existing gameplay. I'll explain some of these components later. Now, if you ask any FGO player, there are quite a lot of these difficulty walls in the game, and which ones you would feature can also be subjective. I'll be singling out the ones that I thought left the deepest impression on me. If we're talking about the most infamous difficulty walls, then there isn't a better candidate than Gawain. The Camelot chapter is considered the first time the story of FGO improves dramatically, and it comes with a handful of bosses that will likely ruin your day. Gawain is going to be most new players' first barrier, even considering this chapter came out almost 10 years ago. Prior to this point, you can mostly get away with just having a broken friend support carry you the entire way, but this one is different. This fight represents the first time where you have to pay attention to class advantage damage, defense buffs, and general team composition. Due to Gawain dealing an obscene amount of damage every time he uses his noble phantasm, you'll either need good survivability or having favorable classes in your loadout to stand a chance. I'm sure he's not so bad these days given the power creep over the years, but unless you know that this fight is coming up, it will catch you off guard and will likely stump you for a little bit. Arc 2 of the main story represents many challenges of its own, mainly the break bar system that prevents you from one-shotting the boss in one turn, and more complex mechanics that affect both you and the enemy. One of the harder challenges come from Lost Belt 5 against Demeter. This one was definitely one of the harder fights when I got to it, and it comes from a multitude of ways that makes it troublesome to complete. You're forced to bring Canis as a mandatory NPC support, meaning that you can't use a broken friend support of your own. Not only that, Canis does not have class advantage nor special gimmicks that makes her a good fit for this fight, so most of the time she's basically a brick on your team. Demeter is a 3-phase fight, and upon breaking the first bar, she will strip your entire team of all buffs and nullify the next 3 buffs you place, meaning that she will get a free turn to hit you with no way to defend against. In the last phase, she will heal every turn and gets an unremovable revive when her health reaches 0. This means you can't be running low on steam during the entire fight because you will lose to this war of attrition. Demeter is quite infamous in the FGO storyline and lives on as one of the tougher opponents you'll face. When you finally win, you'll breathe a sigh of relief as you learn that it turns out you do have enough firepower to defeat even an Olympian god. For its time though, if we were to discuss what's arguably the toughest boss fight in the entire game, then I think there's little room to doubt that the winner belongs to this fluffy, rotating giant. Cernunnos is the final boss fight in Lost Spell 6, and was often touted as the hardest fight when compared to everything that had come before. Narratively, it's incredibly fitting to how much the story built it up to be the final adversary, and this one is no joke. First, you're forced to pick from one of 3 story support NPCs, though one of them is a clear choice. The boss has 4 phases and belongs to the Berserker class, meaning that it will deal more damage to virtually every other servant class in the game. The main gimmick is that it starts out with these curse stacks, where the boss has damage resistance the more stacks it has. You have to hit it in order to remove one, and doing so will cause it to heal, place a life drain debuff to the unit that attacked it, and apply a curse stack to your party. If you don't have a frequent way to remove these stacks, then you just keep taking chip damage every turn and eventually lose. This is not accounting for the fact that Cernunnos will attack your entire frontline and does it 3 times a turn. Given that its attacks have increased crit chance during phase 3, this means that one unfortunately timed attack will wipe out your team. It's one of the toughest challenges any player will face when going through the story, and probably explains why they gave everyone a bunch of free revive tokens to help you get through it. Also worth mentioning, all of these encounters can be beaten with low rarity units. Just like the case with Arknights, it's genuinely pretty impressive when you see it happen. The gacha system in FGO is absolute ass, but its story and how its challenging fights synergize with the narrative as how your party has to deal against your stacked odds makes it a worthwhile play in my opinion. So there we have it, a subjective list of the hardest main story fights in gacha games I've played so far. Let me know if you have any horror stories surrounding the difficulty of main story content in gacha games you play. If you want more gacha analysis and reviews, subscribe to the channel. You can support for as little as $2 a month on Patreon. As always, thank you for watching, be sure to spend moderately, and have fun out there.